Welcome back to the final hour of the Don Carpenter Show on News Talk 1270 KIML.
News Talk 1270 KIML. Don Carpenter Show. Welcome back to the program, coming up on 9:08, and I'm pleased to welcome a special guest to the show. On the line, we have Phil Kerpen, the president of American Commitment. Good morning.
Good morning, Don. How are you?
Good. I'm glad you could join us this morning. We actually have a couple things we're going to talk about. One of them even came up. We were talking off the air a little bit, and I'm pleased we'll get to talk about that in just a few minutes. But for those that aren't familiar with American Commitment, just give us a little bit of a background before we get started of what you do and maybe a little bit of your personal background as well.
Yeah, we are a national free market advocacy group. We're dedicated to limited government and free markets. And we work on taxes, spending, healthcare, energy policy, and regulatory policy. And what we do, it's a little different from some of the other groups, is we don't do the long 20 or 30-page papers. We do pride ourselves on getting our facts and research right, but everything we put out is very short and to the point, so that if you've got just a couple of minutes to watch a video or read one of our items, you'll understand what the issue is, and we also make it very easy to be an active citizen. So we have a lot of forms on our site that make it easy to send letters into Congress or comments into federal regulatory agencies or what have you. And my personal background, I've been running this current group for almost 3 years. Before that, I was with Americans for Prosperity for about 6 years. Before that, I was at the Free Enterprise Fund. Before that, the Club for Growth, and before that, the Cato Institute.
Okay, so you definitely have a background in free market advocacy.
Yeah, I would say it's my whole life.
Yeah.
Professional life, that is. My wife and kids wouldn't like me to say it's my whole life, but yeah, my whole career has been in sort of free market advocacy, domestic economic policy. Okay,
so and again, you mentioned your website. Your website is AmericanCommitment.org, and you mentioned how easy it is to send off emails to members of Congress and things like that. And right off the bat, right at the very front of the website, is a form where you can send an email about the FCC internet takeover, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But first, I wanted to talk about Keystone. As you probably heard, if you were listening to the local news, oil and coal and energy is a huge part of what we do up here. I mean, this is probably a good 90% of the economy in this part of the state of Wyoming. And this Keystone fight is something we've been watching with interest, because it cuts down through the corner of the Dakotas within 100 miles of where we are. So it's possible that some people around here might be working on that pipeline. What's your group's view on this fight over the pipeline right now?
Well, I mean, we think it's shameful that the federal government would delay a permit application for years and years and years and years. This is the most studied infrastructure project in U.S. history, and it's been sitting there for political reasons, and it's really pretty outrageous. And just to tell you where this stands right now, this bill is now passed the House and the Senate. They held it last week because the Congress was on vacation, but they will send it to the White House probably today or tomorrow. And the president will have 10 days. He'll finally have to decide to either sign or veto this thing. He's been trying to ride the fence forever because he doesn't want to anger either the environmentalists or the unions. And so he's got sort of two major financial backers and key constituencies of the left that have been fighting over this, which is why he's tried to avoid making a decision year after year after year. And it's put up or shut up time. He's finally going to have to pick a side, and unfortunately, it looks like he's going to side with the environmentalists and veto this, but we'll know soon enough for sure.
Oh, so it is going. I knew it was going to be either this week or next, but you think it's going to be within the next couple days then?
Yeah, they've already enrolled the bill, and so everything is done. They just waited because they wanted to do it when they were in town, so they didn't do it last week, but they will actually formally send it over either today or tomorrow.
Okay, so, and of course, once the veto happens, the president's finally on record. I mean, this is one of these things he's tried to play both sides of the fence for the past 6 years, saying, well, look, I support this, but we need to study it. We need to study it. And like you said, it is put up or shut up time. What's the next step after that? I mean, I know in the Senate they're about 6 votes away from an override. That's probably an unsurmountable number, right?
Well, it's 4. It's 4 votes short. They got 63 on the last vote for this, so they'll be 4 votes short in the Senate of the 67 they need for an override. It will go to the Senate first if he vetoes it, because the final bill they passed was the Senate version. So it'll go back to the Senate. They will have a veto override vote. It probably will be the same 63, so they'll fail to get there. But if we can get enough pressure on 4 more Democrats and get to that 67, then it would head back to the House. And in the House, on the last vote, it was at 270, which is 19 votes short of what it would need for a veto override. It was up from 266 on the previous vote. So it is inching up in the right direction, but it is still at the present short 4 votes in the Senate, and if it somehow got those 4, it would be 19 in the House. I suspect he'll veto it. It'll go to the Senate. He will have a failed override vote, and that'll be the end of it. So we won't have another vote in the House.
Well, and again, I mean, this is something that could have been done years ago. It could have been done years ago. Yeah, should have been. Now, there's a little bit more to the story than this, though, isn't there?
Yeah, there is. Well, first of all, in 2011, there were 3 months in a row the State Department put out press releases saying that the whole process would be completed by the end of the year. And we're still talking about this in 2015, which is pretty astonishing in itself. And to sort of understand how this happened, I think you need to understand the politics behind it, and particularly the money politics behind it. The largest donor in American politics by far is a San Francisco hedge fund billionaire named Tom Steyer, who spent $75 million of his own money supporting Democrats last year. And before he did that, he had a big fundraiser at his house. Al Gore was there, Harry Reid, a bunch of these Democratic candidates. And he basically said, I will spend at least $50 million of my own money and raise another $50 million from other candidates if you agree to kill this pipeline. And he decided that this would be the litmus test that he would have for support. And by the way, he came up short on the $50 million he was going to raise from other donors, but he spent $75 of his own money instead of the $50 he had promised. So I guess that makes up for it. And this is a guy, he's probably the biggest hypocrite in American politics because he made all his money running offshore hedge funds in the Cayman Islands and Mauritius and Singapore, advertising to investors that he would avoid U.S. taxes, and mostly investing in foreign coal projects. So he invested in coal projects in Indonesia, Argentina, China, etc. And then he tries to come to the U.S. and bankroll all these liberal candidates and environmentalist groups saying we shouldn't have access to fossil fuels in America, which is just astonishing. And the guy says he learned his lesson and changed his ways and all this kind of thing. But actually what he's done is he's shifted his investments into renewables and green energy in the U.S., and now he wants to hamstring his fossil fuel competitors so he can make even more billions. But I was trying to understand what the mentality was behind taking on this pipeline, because the State Department's own analysis says that approving the pipeline would significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions because it would get a lot of oil off of the crude, the trains. The crude by rail is higher emissions. It also would mean less shipping by tankers. The State Department said if they reject the pipeline, that rejection would increase greenhouse gas emissions 28 to 42%. So you would think, aha, the people who really care about global warming should be for it, but they're not. They're against it. And I found a video of this fellow, Tom Steyer, in 2013 at Berkeley, and you can find it through our website, where he actually explains this. He says, we can't go on with business as usual. If we kill this pipeline, it's the Pearl Harbor moment for the climate change movement, and it'll pave the way to the rest of our agenda. He actually says, quote, a carbon tax is a given, close quote, if we kill the pipeline. And so it's not about the environmental merits of the pipeline itself. It's about imposing the political will of this very rich donor and all the environmentalist groups he backs, and their belief that that'll pave the way to the rest of their anti-energy, anti-fossil fuels agenda. And I hope that they're wrong about that. I hope even if Obama kills this pipeline, it doesn't lead to all the rest of that. But that is the motivation that you need to understand to make sense of what's happening, why the merits of the project have nothing to do with what these groups are doing.
Now, this Steyer, I mean, he this is all about his personal enrichment. I mean, that's basically what it comes down to, and you see this all the time with these green energy investors. They want every possible roadblock put in the way of traditional fossil energies so that they can get subsidies, so that they can force people to buy their products and so on.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And in fact, Steyer was the funding behind the whole scandal that just took down the governor in Oregon. It was his money that was paying the first lady to lobby for the low carbon fuel standard that would have made a whole bunch of money for him and the other alternative energy investors. And so there's this stench of corruption around this stuff, not just at the federal level, but we're increasingly seeing in the various states as well.
Well, and again, this is somebody. I mean, I've heard of Steyer, but the average person, of course, they know the Koch brothers, and maybe they know George Soros, but nobody really knows about this Steyer. How does he manage to stay under the radar so much?
Well, he's actually trying to have a pretty high profile. He actually thought he might run for U.S. Senate in California until his poll showed him he'd have no chance. And so I think we're going to see a lot more of him. I think he may run for governor of California in a couple of years. It's not like he's trying to hide. He's being very obvious about what he's doing, and he's very proud of it. And so I think it's mostly disinterest from the media, who wants to portray big money in politics as something that happens on the right and not the left, even though the reality is very different.
Yeah, and that's usually the answer to these kind of things, is either a disinterested media or a media interested in maybe hush-hushing things. Yeah, but so this is something we're going to have to take a look at. Do you think? I mean, once this Keystone bill is vetoed, as it probably will be, and it's, if Congress can't override that veto, do you think that's the end for it?
I don't think so. I think that we'll continue to see efforts in Congress to force the president's hand on this by attaching it to must-pass legislation and things of that nature. You may see it attached to the debt ceiling, for instance. When you have an issue that's such an overwhelming political winner and such a no-brainer from an economic and environmental and national security standpoint, you don't let it drop just because the president uses his veto. So I think we'll see, more attempts. To find ways to force the president's hand on this. The other thing is you're going to see a very dishonest effort from the White House and from some media outlets that'll pick up this spin to say that the veto doesn't mean that the president's killed the project. It just means he wants to do, the 19th environmental review or whatever number we're up to now, and, he still hasn't decided. And so they're going to pretend that he still hasn't decided, even though, for all intents and purposes, this is going to be, the final decision from him. But that doesn't mean Congress won't continue to try to overturn him. Okay, so all is not lost in that case. I think if you look at how much money TransCanada's invested in this and how committed they are to this as sort of the solution, I don't think that they'll give up on this. At least until after the presidential election, because if we have a Republican president, they're pretty confident they'll get that permit approved. I think if we have a Democratic president who wins this next election, they'll start looking at the alternative of building a pipeline to the west coast of Canada to get to export terminals. But I think they'll at least wait until then. So the final decision on this won't be known, I don't think, until after the next presidential election. Okay, well, there's always 2016. Okay, so the other thing we wanted to talk about today. And this is one that I haven't spent a lot of time on with my show, but this is something that's a bit of a personal interest to me. The FCC has a vote coming up this week on a if I remember right, 323 page regulation to basically take control of the internet. Can you give us a little bit of a background for those that aren't really familiar with how this has come along? Yeah, we don't know everything that's in it because the 332-page plan, which was written by White House political operatives and then sort of delivered to the FCC chairman, which is supposed to be an independent agency, so this is sort of an unprecedented farce of the idea of the agency's independence. We don't know the details because it's being kept secret, but we know the centerpiece of this plan is to reclassify the Internet. So it would no longer be an information service that's essentially unregulated, but would instead be a telecommunications service under the 1934 Communications Act. And under the 1934 Act, it was designed for the old Ma Bell regulated monopoly telephone system, and it means pervasive government control. And so that reclassification move, saying we're going to change the Internet from an unregulated free market into a totally regulated public utility, means that pretty much every aspect of how the Internet works would now be subject to regulatory approval, and they can decide what's just and reasonable with respect to rates, and so there would be rate regulation. It would be ex post rate regulation. They're not going to set rates in advance, but if somebody doesn't like a rate, they could file a complaint, and then the commission will set rates. There's going to be regulation of network management practices, of business arrangements. Every aspect of the Internet will become subject to regulatory oversight, and at the same time, this is going to bring a lot of tax increases as well, because Internet services are protected from taxes under the Federal Internet Tax Freedom Act. They cannot be taxed. Telecommunication services, what the reclassification would accomplish, public utility services, they are subject to a wide array of state and local taxes, and one think tank study, actually from a liberal group, the Progressive Policy Institute, found that state and local taxes will increase the cost of your Internet bill on average 12.4% after this order takes effect. And then there's also the question of whether there will be new federal universal service fund taxes at the FCC. And in this order, from my understanding, is they defer that decision. They don't take a position on that so that they can publicly say we're not imposing taxes. But, of course, in the future, it's very likely that they would. And so we could have a large federal tax as well as that 12.4% average state and local tax increase. And if you sort of put the pieces together here, why I'm so concerned about this, if we have heavy-handed government regulation, we're going to get a lot less private investment. And there was a recent bipartisan study by Sonicom that found that within 5 years we'll get a 20% decline in private investment in the Internet under these regulations. That big decline in private investment is going to be made up for with taxes, with fees, with those higher state and local fees I mentioned, with future federal universal service fund fees, and we're going to be paying more and more and more of our tax dollars to make up for the private investment that regulation scared away. And then where I get really concerned is I fully believe that once we start paying for the Internet with our tax dollars, the commission will say, well, this is a public resource. We need to have public interest regulation. You're going to start to see all the same types of regulatory apparatus they have for TV and radio brought to bear on the Internet as well. And so I think where this really ends up at the end of the day, even though proponents deny it vociferously, is we get less private investment, more taxes, and then we get content control in the interest of so-called public interest regulation. I just think it is so crazy to start down this path, Don, when there is no problem with how the Internet works now. With the unregulated Internet's been the most remarkable free market success story the world's ever seen for the past couple of decades. You just need to be a really crazy liberal to look at the Internet and say, the problem here is we just don't have enough government regulation, yet, that's what the FCC is about to do on Thursday.
Well, and they've fooled a lot of people by calling this something called net neutrality, which is a concept that every bit of information on the Internet gets the exact same priority when it's sent from one place to another, which is basically what we have now. And what they've done over the past few years is they've started to scare people to think, well, you're not going to be able to stream your Netflix, for example, if we don't take control of this. You're not going to be able to stream. You're not going to be able to stream music. You're not going to be able to do any of the things that you do now. They've scared people into supporting something called net neutrality, which, again, we had already. The unregulated Internet had net neutrality. And they call this...
Of course. Look, Don.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
If the phone company or the cable company started blocking what website you could go to or redirecting your traffic or causing any kind of mischief that the liberal groups like to warn about, they would lose all their customers, and they would be a disaster for them from a business standpoint because the free market works, which is why these things have never happened. And so they've got this sort of theoretical, hypothetical problem that's never happened that they're using as an excuse for all these new regulations.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Plus, they play on the distrust that people have of cable and internet providers as well.
Yeah, I'm going to read you a quote from the guy who started this whole net neutrality movement, a guy named Robert McChesney, who founded the group Free Press that's been the main liberal advocacy group in this. And this is a direct quote. He said, "At the moment, the battle over network neutrality is not to completely eliminate the telephone and cable companies. We are not at that point yet. But the ultimate goal is to get rid of the media capitalists in the phone and cable companies and to divest them from control."
Yeah, absolutely, and that's been the goal from the beginning. And then, of course, you get the guy in charge of the FCC right now, Tom Wheeler, the chairman of the FCC. A lifetime cable lobbyist. So I'm not quite sure why we should trust the FCC to protect us from the big, bad, evil cable companies when a cable lobbyist runs them in the first place.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the interesting point here is, AT&T loved the old monopoly regulation days because they got a guaranteed rate of return. They didn't have to face competition. It was wonderful for them. They got to mint money. They used it for Bell Labs and all the rest of it. And so the idea that, the industry is the opposition of this and they're fighting against it, it's not. It's an oversimplification. There are a lot of industry players who could be perfectly happy being regulated utilities with guaranteed rates of return and so forth. And, public utility regulation has never served the interests of the public very well. If you look historically at the old trucking regulations or the airplane regulations, the idea that turning the internet into a public utility will protect people from the phone and cable companies is very naive. That's not how it tends to work. They tend to collude rather than be antagonists.
Well, you're going to end up with one or two cable companies running the entire internet, and they'll gladly hand over control over content for a rate of return.
I think that's right.
Yeah, and this is something that I again, I haven't spent a lot of time on it on my show, but this is something that people definitely need to know about, and it's right on the front page of your website again, AmericanCommitment.org. What do you think? Now, the vote on this is a few days away. I mean, it's going to be a 3-2 vote. That's the way the FCC board sits. There's 3 Democrats, 2 Republicans, all put in place by the president, by the way. Do you think, I mean, obviously it passes. Do you think Congress can do anything to stop it?
Well, I sure hope so, and that's what we're asking them to do, is to step in and stop this. And there are basically two approaches that they can take to that. One would be to try to get a bipartisan deal with Democrats that kind of says, these basic net neutrality rules that everyone's been following anyway, no blocking, no throttling, no redirecting traffic. We'll make those the law, but we'll block all of these FCC regulations. We will not allow them to turn the internet into a public utility, and that's the approach that Senator Thune is pushing, and he's the chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee, and he thought he had Democrats on board, including Bill Nelson, the ranking member on that committee, but the White House got all the Democrats to jump ship from that. So one solution would be to get Democrats on board with a bipartisan solution that sort of codifies net neutrality, but blocks what the FCC is doing. The other approach, which I prefer, is to just outright overturn what the FCC's done and to attach that as appropriations language to a must-pass bill funding the government and to have a showdown over the issue, because the public is overwhelmingly opposed to internet regulation. I think it could be a political win if Republicans had the fortitude to stand and fight. And so we're urging Congress to pursue both of those things, to pursue a legislative solution, but also to include defunding language and to be willing to fight on that.
Okay, so it's one of these things. It's going to be an ongoing fight over the next probably year or so. Hopefully Congress can get something done on it. I mean, it really is. It's vitally important because content restrictions. Anytime you deal with the FCC, and as someone who has dealt with the FCC before, I can tell you, you don't want them nosing in on your internet because it's not good stuff.
Yeah, the one group of people who really get this are broadcasters. Every broadcaster I talk to, the prospect of the FCC having regulatory oversight of the internet sends them up a wall because you guys have all dealt with them.
Oh,
you know what they're like. You know what a disaster this would be.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, just a personal story real quick. I know you probably don't have a whole lot of time, but my old station, we would get the crazies coming in every day asking to see the public file, and every radio station has to carry a public file, and they'd root through it and try to find inconsistencies that they could, get the license of the station pulled just because they disagreed with the content. And you'll see that kind of stuff with the internet. The internet providers will have to provide a public file of some sort, and some wacko could go in, and if they don't like what people are watching, they'll just have the FCC block that website. And it's not that far away. Yeah.
I think you're right, and I just think it's crazy to start down this path when there's no actual problem that's being solved here. It's all a bunch of hocus pocus.
Absolutely. Again, I want to give you a chance to mention all of your all the places. If anybody has any questions, you can go to americancommitment.org. There's lots of information there about a lot of different issues. Do you have a Twitter, Facebook, anything you want to make sure you plug?
Yeah, my Twitter is just my last name. It's KERP as in Peter, EN as in Nancy, and we are also on Facebook. It's American Commitment on Facebook, and we post a lot of our stuff there. And on our website, if you click on the Action tab at the top, we've got specific action forms that make it very easy to be active on these issues we've discussed.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Again, Phil Kerpen from American Commitment, americancommitment.org. I want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk to you again soon. I was going through your website, and there are a million things I'd like to talk to you about, so hopefully we can do it again soon.
Sounds good. Have a good one.
Hey, thanks a lot. And on that note, we're going to have to take a break. News Talk 1270, KIML.
Catch up on Gillette Wild Hockey News with Coach Winkler every Tuesday at 9:30. Don Carpenter on News Talk 1270 KIML. 1270.